unprecedented look at a decade in power now on BBC One. The key players give an insight of the tussles at the top in the start of our major new series, The Blair Years.
Tony Blair and Gordon Brown spent 10 years in Downing Street, in the two most important jobs in British politics. We were filming at number 10 on the day Blair finally handed over power to his old friend and rival. Tonight, the story of Blair's mission to change Britain and transform its public services, and how it was shaped by the complex relationship between the two men.
The relationship between myself and Gordon was a different type of political relationship than most between prime ministers and chancellors. That's true, and it's also true, I mean, the point in being silly about it, that there were tensions from time to time.
I think he became increasingly frustrated with the Chancellor and no doubt did think about what he might be able to do about that.
There were people at times who were saying to Tony, look, is it sensible to keep Gordon at the Treasury? Well, the answer to the question is, well, is it sensible to have him out of the Treasury?
You know, when you're Prime Minister, you're aware that other people may want to succeed you. And I always used to say to people, it's not an ignoble ambition. I mean, why shouldn't he want to be Prime Minister?
In the weeks before Tony Blair left office, and in the time since, he has given the BBC an unprecedented insight into his time in power. Blair agreed to a series of interviews with Times journalist David Aronovich to reflect on his time at number 10. Later episodes will tell the stories of Blair's war in Iraq and of his transformation from crowd pleaser to messianic leader. In his last days as Prime Minister, Blair was anxious to prove to the world that his legacy was a transformation of his country.
Because I was just saying to the governor, I mean, all the schools in the country are basically being either rebuilt completely or refurbished.
Very nice.
Blair spent an entire decade at number 10.
Yeah, I thought you were.
But as he prepared for Gordon Brown to take over, he was still concerned that his vision for Britain had not been understood.
My single principal motivating anxiety for the country is for us as a country to understand the scale and the intensity and the speed of change.
Blair was one of the most dominant figures in British political history, and yet for much of his time as Prime Minister, he couldn't get his way.
It's going to be bad. Oh, it's my fault.
Though it was Blair who had grabbed the Labour leadership, Gordon Brown had always seen himself as the senior member of this extraordinary political partnership. When the two men led Labour to a general election landslide in 1997, Gordon Brown assumed it wouldn't be too long before he could take over from Blair as Prime Minister. Within a week of taking power, Tony and Gordon showed what they could achieve when they worked together. Within days, they made a bold political move. They took control of interest rates out of the hands of politicians and created an independent Bank of England.
What you had to do above all else was say to the British people, everything you have learnt, you know, from your mother's knee about the Labour Party and its capability or otherwise of governing, forget it. This is a party that can govern the country and in particular can run the economy well. That's why the Bank of England independence was of such, you know, momentous importance to me. What I didn't want with a decision as big as this, I didn't want any argy-bargy about it.
Britain's most senior civil servant was astonished that Blair and Brown didn't see the need even to consult the new cabinet on the biggest economic decision the new government was ever likely to make.
What I remember him saying to me is, they will all agree. And I said, but that's not really the point. I think that we have cabinet government in this country. This is a big decision. I think people outside may well ask and will expect that the decision has been taken by the cabinet.
If you'd had a cabinet discussion, everyone's sitting around and people had said, well, we think it's a bad idea, and that had come out, you would have, I think the government would have ended before it began. You know, obviously if Gordon had been against it, that would have been a different matter altogether, but he wasn't. He was absolutely for it. Myself and the Chancellor were absolutely on all fours together. Gordon and I talked about it very closely together. Gordon and I were fine about it. We just had to get it done.
I have therefore decided to give the Bank of England operational responsibility for setting interest rates with immediate effect.
Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were the inner cell of New Labour. That a lot of what they had done in bringing the Labour Party round to New Labour, they had done as an almost revolutionary cell. And that they weren't much in the business of consulting their colleagues in order to determine policies.
Brown thought he should be Prime Minister. He tolerated being number 2 because he had the prospect of taking over from Blair, and because he was given unprecedented influence on the government's policies for Britain. The government had not one head, but 2, and they didn't always see eye to eye. Just months after Blair and Brown took power, they clashed on welfare reform. Tony Blair had chosen maverick Labour MP Frank Field, a radical thinker on the benefit system, to be Minister for Welfare Reform. Field wanted fundamental changes.
I've described the system as one which works against the grain of human nature, which doesn't in any way adequately reward work, penalises savings, and encourages people not to tell the truth.
I love Frank. I think he's a great guy, and I really have got a lot of time for him, a lot of respect for him.
Blair started to explore if Field's vision to revitalise Britain's poor could be made to work. But Gordon Brown had very different ideas about how to go about tackling poverty.
The whole welfare reform programme hit the buffers very early on because it was thought that the ideas that I was promoting were very different from the ideas that Gordon Brown was promoting as Chancellor, and indeed they were. There was this extraordinary tension between the two of them. Gordon was adamant that nothing really was going to happen. And while the Prime Minister then, as he was incredibly gentle with the Chancellor, there was no give at all. And one just wondered, why do you put up with this? What is the relationship between the two of you that allows this to go on, and at what point are you going to sack him? And the Chancellor just glared from the other side of the table and sort of growled. And the Prime Minister then behaved as though he was looking after an adolescent son, you know, that it's going through a bad patch.
Only a year after Tony Blair gave Frank Field the job, he took it away. Gordon Brown's influence over welfare reform would remain. Blair and Brown were still willing to try to patch things up, and even put on a show of togetherness.
Well, I hope you guys do well. This is going to be difficult, isn't it?
It looks natural, inviting the neighbour in to watch the football, but they're together in the Chancellor's Downing Street flat at a time of reported tension between them. They're eager, no doubt, to portray a picture of friendliness.
I don't think you'll find that any Chancellor and Prime Minister have worked more closely in this century.
Well, thank goodness it's only a game.
But in reality, the tensions at the heart of New Labour would only get more intense. Gordon Brown's tough spending plans had won him a reputation for prudence. But by the winter of 1999, the NHS was seriously short of cash.
We'd come in with a commitment that we would keep to the previous government's spending plans. So we put in some extra money into the health service, but not a very great deal. So there was a tight financial situation. I was receiving letters from people that were heartbreaking letters about people waiting for their heart operation their husband or their relative and dying on a waiting list because they couldn't get treated quickly enough. Every winter, the pressures were such that they were just tipping the health service over.
It was hell on wheels. It was just unbelievable. I mean, the National Health Service was in the newspapers and at the top of the news continually.
Hospitals right across the United Kingdom are still struggling to cope with the flu outbreak. The Conservative leader William Hague said ministers should have seen the problem coming and claimed that bad planning was the real reason for the shortage of NHS beds.
You know, if you have people dying on trolleys, or if you have a case like the case of Mavis Skeet, the appalling case of somebody not being treated and all that flowed from that, of course it deserves to be in the newspapers.
Mavis Skeet had an urgent operation cancelled 4 times because of shortages.
Since early December, Mavis Skeet has been waiting for surgery to remove cancer from her throat.
My mum's a very, very strong person, but I think the 4th time of this happening has really knocked her back, and she just broke down into floods of tears.
I really came to the view that we needed a fundamental change of approach where we would really make the commitment on investment and, in a way, take away the excuse of money.
The crisis brought out the very different personal approaches of Blair and Brown.
By temperament, Tony was more of a cavalier, somebody who would carry the banner for change, charge for change, try and make it happen. And Gordon was a more considered, more of a roundhead Cromwellian figure in the way that he went about it in a very long-term, planned way. And so there was a difference of personality as well that was involved in the process.
Under pressure from the media, one morning Blair decided he would announce a sea change in health spending. He also decided not to seek permission from Gordon Brown first. In January 2000, Blair was booked to appear on Breakfast with Frost to talk about the NHS crisis. Under the Conservatives, Britain's spending on health had always lagged far behind the average in the rest of Europe. During his chat with Sir David Frost, he made a statement that sounded like the usual politician speak, but turned out to signal the biggest shift in health spending since the Second World War.
If we can carry on getting real-term rises in the health service of almost 5%, then at the end of that 5 years, we will be in a position where our health service spending comes up to the average of the European Union. It's too low at the moment.
That day, the government's most senior health advisors thought they had a Sunday off. But Blair had not thought to ask them to work out the detail of his announcement. Minutes after the Frost programme, number 10 hit the phones.
Pager goes off, number 10 on the line.
Around midday that day, the phone started to ring, and it virtually didn't stop ringing until about 9 o'clock at night.
Part of the issue here, of course, was that there was then this big faffing about to actually discover precisely what words Tony had used on Breakfast with Frost.
At the end of that 5 years, we will be in a position where our health service spending comes up to the average of the European Union.
And then this rather kind of Delphic construction as to what this actually meant had to be turned into something that was coherent and tangible.
The problem was, it was a Sunday, and most of the facts and figures were shut up in offices in Whitehall.
Luckily, my elder daughter's boyfriend had a quite sophisticated in those days a little calculator that had a compound interest function on it. I had the OECD data on the computer, and together we ran all sorts of different calculations to check out that it did add up.
It was at this point that Blair's advisors discovered he had not told his own Chancellor about the biggest spending announcement they'd ever make.
There clearly, as we know, had been no consultation with the Treasury about this as a commitment, though the Treasury had been happy to provide the figures as an illustration, because in the conference call there was a reference to is GB on side, or words to that effect. And the answer was towards the effect that he would have to be because the Prime Minister had spoken.
I think it was courageous because, as you now know, not every I was dotted and not every T was crossed, and it needed that calculator to work out some of the fine detail. That is quite a thing to do.
Gordon Brown had also wanted to increase health spending, but he wanted to do it prudently. Now, Blair had to face his stern Chancellor to explain himself.
Did you tell him what you were going to say on the Frost programme beforehand?
We'd had discussions going back some weeks about this, and I can't remember the exact ins and outs, but there were discussions about forms of words that would be used. It's fair to say probably would have preferred me not to have said it in that way, but I was very sure that we had to send that signal out very clearly. And to be fair, once that was done, if it hadn't been for the Treasury providing the cash, it wouldn't have happened.
You bounced him?
No, I don't think bounce. I didn't bounce. I mean, this has been a debate going on for a long time, but you were going to come to this point at any event.
The settled view about this is that the Chancellor told you that he thought you had stolen his effing budget. Is that true?
No, he didn't say that. What he did say was, this is a big commitment and it's going to be a real sweat to meet it. And he did meet it. And that's really all I need to say and kind of want.
So the spirit was really, it's going to be a sweat to do it, so thank you.
There is commentary that other people can make, but not me.
Gordon Brown was invited to take part in this series, but didn't accept. By 2000, 3 years into government, Blair and Brown's personal friendship seemed well and truly over. A Number 10 source revealed that when Gordon Brown got married, he decided only to tell Tony Blair the day before. And as time went on, policy insiders saw deeper and deeper differences emerge between Brown and Blair.
They had different agendas. They had different priorities. The Chancellor, reasonably and rightly, was above all focused on an agenda for the poor. The Prime Minister, above all, was focused on an agenda for the whole of the country. He wanted to make the public sector more effective for everyone. He had different ideas about how to prioritise public spending, and they clashed.
There were two centres of power. Number 10 and Number 11 were both there. They were working sometimes in parallel, sometimes against each other. When they worked together, they were a very powerful force for change. It was often frustrating in particular departments because we had a set of mandates from Number 10 about what they wanted us to do in relation to our own performance, and a set of mandates from Number 11 about what they wanted us to do in terms of our performance, and that was frustrating and time-consuming and inefficient for government.
I think that constructive conflict can lead to the most enormous, powerful change, and that happened on many occasions between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. The destructive element often weakened both of them and destabilised the government.
Tony Blair's staff also experienced tensions with Gordon Brown's Treasury team. They say reaching agreement on the right policies, though it happened in the end, was tortuously difficult.
I mean, the Treasury likes to control and actually doesn't like to hand things over very much, and is nervous about change.
Oh, there were plenty of times that you'd go to meetings and Treasury officials would treat you with utter disdain. It would be a sort of combination of believing you to be unspeakably right-wing and unspeakably stupid.
At times it drove you mad that the Treasury were arguing over elements of this, that and the other policy.
Bitter divisions between Blair and Brown surfaced over how to reform health and education. Both men wanted to do it their way. Before he took power, Tony Blair had always derided the Tory policy of using markets to make public services work better.
First of all, we'll get rid of that Conservative internal market that's caused so much damage in the National Health Service. We've had enough of running it like a supermarket. It's not a supermarket, it's a public service.
But after a few years in power, Blair's stance changed profoundly. He now became convinced that hospitals and schools needed market incentives to improve.
A quasi-market situation where you can test the service or the consumers get greater choice. Inject this greater sense of dynamism, contestability, competition was basically breaking down the monolith of the old public services. If people think they're going to get their paycheck and they're going to keep their position, irrespective of how good a service they deliver, irrespective of whether they adjust to change or not, well, you know, human nature being what it is, they sit back.
Blair's thinking was moving rapidly away from the instincts of a large number of Labour MPs.
I wanted the Labour Party to be a political party for people that wanted to do well and be successful, as well as people who cared about society. And education is just tremendously important about that, both wanting a good education for yourself, but also wanting the best for your children. You know, I remember an occasion when a member of my staff came to see me and said, well, I've got something to tell you, and, you know, I think you'll find this very difficult. And, you know, I understand if you find it difficult for me to carry on working for you. And I was thinking, what's going on? Some terrible scandal. And they said, I'm going to send my son to a private school. I said, yes. And I was kind of, they expect me to say, well, in that case, my goodness me, you are next to a criminal, you must leave my employment. I mean, it's, now, obviously, my task is to try and make sure the state education system is so good that people want their children to go there. But, you know, there's something in this concept of aspiration that for me was so important. And so if you take it a step back from private school, for me, there could never be anything wrong with someone saying, look, I'm not prepared to send my child to this state school. I want to send them to a different one because it's better. It's going to provide a better education for my child.
Market reforms were bound to alienate many in the Labour Party. But was Gordon Brown on board? For more than a year, Brown was, in public, guarded on the issue.
Well, we used to watch Gordon Brown, and it's a little like watching the Sphinx, really. You're never quite sure what's going on there. Brown was good at staying out of the way. He was very skillful as Chancellor at just keeping quiet when he wasn't happy with something.
Eventually, Brown did speak out. Brown said markets should have a role in public services, but, unlike Blair, he chose to emphasise the limits and failures of markets.
Our clear and robust defence of markets must be combined with a clear and robust recognition of their limits. In health, not only is the consumer not sovereign, but a free market in healthcare will not produce the most efficient price for its services. So the many market failures in health, if taken individually, challenge the adequacy of markets to provide efficient market solutions.
Both Gordon and Tony had their own reform histories, their own commitments to reform, but they believed in reform in very, very different ways. Gordon's view, which I think is again very respectable, was a view that you could create a different law, different set of arrangements, different set of funding regimes to bring about and promote change throughout the country. And that was a very traditional Labour way of looking at things. Tony's view was rather more anarchic in character, and I used to characterise it as social entrepreneurship. He would say, give people, whether people running schools or hospitals or whoever, the ability to go out and drive and make change themselves, and that would be a more effective route to change.
The centrepiece of Blair's NHS reforms were new foundation hospitals, modern organisations which would be free from central government control so they could make their own decisions about their finances and management.
Tony spent a lot of time engaging Gordon on the question of foundation hospitals, but there were quite substantial disagreements.
I don't know what was in Gordon's mind at the time, but obviously there were concerns. What is unreasonable is for legitimate concerns to tip into ideological concerns. Now, I like to think that that is not what was motivating people.
In late September 2002, Gordon Brown presented cabinet members with a 50-page memo setting out a host of objections he had to the proposed financial regime for foundation hospitals.
There was circulated a 50-page memo about the problems about foundation hospitals to the cabinet, which wasn't written by you, and it wasn't written by the Health Secretary.
Yeah. It's not an emerging theme here, is there? There was an issue to do with borrowing powers and so on, but yeah, but I mean, you can always say why something's a bad idea. That's the point. You know, it's... And there's nothing you can do to, as I say, to prove that it isn't.
A week later, on the 7th of October 2002, a showdown meeting took place at number 10 Downing Street.
But there's Alan and Gordon there. I think John Prescott was there as well. And that was obviously to try and work out how we found a way through the concerns the Treasury had on the one side and, you know, Alan's desire to make this a radical model.
And my feeling all the way through this was that actually the whole thing sat together and I didn't want it watered down at all. However, the concerns were such from the Treasury that Tony felt that a compromise was needed. And I remember it said, well, if you do that, then the integrity of the policy is lost. And what we really want to achieve is not 100% what we're going to achieve. I know, but we're going to have to reach a compromise. And I said, fine, you're the boss. You know, if that's what you think is necessary. And he said, you know why? We've got to get this settled. It can't go on. It's running out of control. It's all over the media, dominating the party conference, etc. Let us just get it settled.
Blair reluctantly agreed to curb the freedom from Treasury control that he had wanted for Foundation hospitals.
I tell you, within a matter of, I can't remember whether it was weeks or months, but I was having a conversation with him, and Tony said to me that he regretted the compromise.
Did you regret the compromise afterwards?
Any of these compromises I always prefer not to make, but on the other hand, the most important thing is to get the policy through. And in the end, actually, the compromise proved to be a lot more marginal than I originally anticipated.
Gordon Brown wanted Blair to announce that he would leave number 10 at the end of his second term. Blair did consider saying he would go, but he decided that if he left, his mission to change public services would never be achieved.
The suggestion is that one of the reasons you decided to stay on because you had to see these reforms through was because you thought that Gordon Brown was not 100% committed to them.
It wasn't so much that I didn't think he was committed to them. It's that I felt real ownership of this. I could have decided to leave before the end of that term, but in the end I decided not to because I wanted to see through the reform programme that we were doing, and I believe that that was the best thing for us, and also because we were right in the middle of, you know, really tough things in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on, but primarily because there was a clear domestic reform programme that I'd really got, you know, the reins between my hands at that point and wanted to see it through.
The question that begs is why you thought that no one else would.
I don't think it's so much that I don't think that anyone else would. It's that I'd been right in the middle of it. There were certain things that I wanted to get absolutely secure and bolted down before I left, which was, again, not something that I did because I thought no one else could do it. I mean, I wasn't sort of, stupidly arrogant enough to think that, but because I had begun it and was right in the middle of it and should complete it.
Some at number 10 thought that since Blair was staying put, Brown had to go.
There were people at times who were saying to Tony, look, is it sensible to keep Gordon at the Treasury? Well, the answer to the question is, well, is it sensible to have him out of the Treasury? And I think his judgment was driven, in the end, by an understanding that Gordon had an ability that was greater than his colleagues. Now, that ability to run a department, to manage the economy in the way that he did, is the best harnessing of his talent. Imagine it on the outside. Not a very happy thought.
Blair was about to go into battle with rebel Labour MPs over his health and education reforms, and that would give Brown a new opportunity. From spring 2003, Blair faced a series of momentous showdowns in Parliament. the Conservatives saw a government at war with itself.
I can remember Blair attending a PLP, a Parliamentary Labour Party meeting, where there was huge rows going on inside the meeting. All of this stuff was really worrying the heart and soul of the Labour Party, because it looked like they were reneging, which they were, on their pledges. And so that was the bit that we could see was really festering away.
Friends of Gordon Brown think Blair reaped the consequences of a destructive approach to his own party.
With Tony, you'd have a combative parliamentary process with amendments and all the rest of it, half his party against him. Tony didn't mind if it involved confrontation. Gordon did mind. But if he thought there was a reasoned way of putting together some arguments that people would agree with, and the country more would agree with, he'd go that route. And I think that's the sensible way to go.
For Labour's chief whip, the conflict between Brown and Blair made Parliament harder to handle.
It did make it much more difficult when it was perceived that there wasn't absolute unity at the top of government. We've always known this in the Labour Party, and those years, those experiences reinforced that again and again to me.
Blair's plan to allow elite universities to charge students higher fees than other universities was another sore point with Labour MPs. Labour's 2001 election manifesto had pledged not to introduce top-up fees.
It was pretty much a balls up, to be honest. I mean, Labour committed not to have variable tuition fees in its 2001 manifesto, which was a blitheringly stupid thing to do. There's absolutely no need to do it.
But soon after the election in 2002, Tony Blair decided that he would consider introducing top-up fees after all.
You can get into a convoluted argument about what the manifesto means and what we were doing, whether it's consistent, inconsistent, and so on. But I mean, the fact of the matter is it was obviously a huge political problem. It's true that it's there in the manifesto. However, as I used to say to people, it is also true that the universities are saying we cannot wait 4 or 5 years for another election and then decide that we need change. So what do you do? And in the end, surely the most important thing is to put the country first.
Blair was vulnerable and needed Brown's support. But Brown favoured a different policy, a special tax for graduates, and wanted to delay any reform.
The Treasury's view was that this was not the right thing, that it would it could have damaging effects, and that it was politically extremely difficult to do.
The Chancellor in particular felt that we didn't need to be doing the reform at this particular stage, and we could have some kind of commission to look into it into the future and deal with it in a future Parliament, and he made that case.
As we've had it told by people involved, it was nearly impossible to get the Treasury to engage with doing the work that was necessary in the early stages to get this off the ground. What was that about?
Well, part of the difficulty was, I think most people could accept that university finance had to be reformed. The question was what was the right way to do it, and some people wanted a pure graduate tax. Some people wanted the system that we were introducing. And that took some time to resolve, and probably in retrospect we should have resolved it faster.
But again, going back to the difficulties of getting this thing done, this was described as interdepartmental guerrilla warfare. It's just to get the figures out upon which you could base the policy.
Well, it was difficult, let's say. But anyway, it was done in the end.
It was time for Parliament to show its claws. 2 backbench MPs emerged as key opponents of Blair's reforms, in both education and in health.
So you'd be setting up a 2 or 3 tier system where the rich, able to get the money, would go to the Class A universities, which charge 10, 20,000 a year, and then there would be the others where the poorer people went.
I'm proud that my party introduced the National Health Service. I'm proud that at the core of our thinking is the fundamental equity principle, and I worry that these proposals contained today will increase disparities between hospitals rather than reduce them.
Blair's battles over health and education were coming to a head at Labour's conference in Bournemouth in September 2003. The conference was waiting to see if the Chancellor would give strong backing to the embattled Prime Minister. Gordon Brown used his keynote speech to send out what many thought was a clear political signal. Just 1 year earlier, Tony Blair had confronted Labour conference with tough talk on the necessity for reform.
I believe that we are at our best when at our boldest. And so far, we've made a good start. But frankly, we've not been bold enough.
Now, Brown used a similar phrase with a striking difference.
This Labour Party, best when we're boldest, best when we're united, best when we are Labour.
Labour's rebels felt they didn't have to read between the lines. One says he met Brown's closest aide, Ed Balls, who in 2007 is a cabinet minister, on the seafront at Bournemouth.
I met Ed, and Ed said, gosh, you've been on the telly and the radio quite a bit recently on the issue. Keep going, that's good, excellent, you know, very good idea to keep fighting the cause. So it wasn't, the walking past looking elsewhere. It wasn't all over me or anything like that, but he was actually saying, good for you, keep going, it's very important, It was certainly, an encouragement, and that's how I took it.
Ed Balls says he can't recall this conversation and that he never encouraged any MP to vote against Tony Blair. The Labour MP who led the fight against Blair's health reforms also says he was encouraged by Brown's allies.
There was more than one ally of Gordon that I was in contact with, and the message was loud and clear that they fully understood where we were and good luck to us. And behind the scenes, we were being given a fair bit of help on some of the technical financial questions, because obviously health service finance is quite complex, and when you move into a new system and new structures, then we were raising questions about what the implications would be, and we were getting some pretty clear answers that all added up to a much stronger case from our point of view.
Blair's colleagues were convinced that Blair himself believed Labour's rebels were getting secret encouragement from Gordon Brown's team.
Tony certainly thought that there were people who were acting at Gordon's behest to try and make this opposition manifest. I was very doubtful about that.
Were you aware that allies of the Chancellor were agitating against the very reforms that you saw as an important part of your package?
Well, people would say these things, but I have to say that every time I talked to Gordon, that he would make it clear he supported them. So, in the end, that was good enough for me. In the end, we got them through. So, look, one thing as well that I know how difficult it is. I mean, I've been talking about how difficult it is to do the job of Prime Minister, and I'm not going to, there's just no point in me getting into going back over the past in a way that will just be used unhelpfully for him. But the fact is, it was a combination of a strong economy allowing the investment together with the reform that I think, has produced great change in this country. So, I'm not hiding the fact there were disagreements or tensions over various issues from time to time. Of course, that's what you'd expect. But at the same time, I believe we were infinitely stronger as a government because of his presence there and because of his achievements.
On top-up fees, the crunch came in January 2004 when the House of Commons voted. Labour rebels lined up with the Conservatives, and Blair faced a defeat which might force his resignation. If Blair had to go, Brown would be implicated and would suffer the fallout. At the last minute, the Chancellor pulled out the stops to avoid a government defeat.
They were quite good at covering it up. Blair and Brown, for all their huge differences, could always put on the act in the end that they were together.
All sides knew the vote was on a knife edge.
One of the most significant implications of a defeat for this bill today would be that universities would be stripped of the resources they need to address the challenges of the future.
Do we increase that marketisation, market forces and so on, to a point that you start to lose the purpose of what education and higher education is all about?
Order! The question is that the bill now be read a second time. Many's their opinion say aye. Aye! The country no. Where the lobby?
With 20 minutes to go, we were winning, and the whips were really working, in the chamber, very hard, sitting next to people, talking to them. Goodness knows what they said to everybody, But it was about, I think, we're going to lose this vote, and the government could go and the Prime Minister could go.
During the day, we were wheeling them out into Gordon's presence, into Tony's presence, and you make sure you contact everybody. And you don't believe people who say, I think if you do this for me, I get half a dozen others, because they very rarely do.
Did you think you might lose it?
Yes. Yes. I knew it was extremely tight. So we counted people in and we count people out.
And there's a great swirl of conflicting rumours, assessments, judgments about what are going on. And people say, oh, you can't possibly do it, you can't possibly do it, or you can do it, it's definitely all right.
Order! Order!
When the vote came, you could see it was going to be very close. It felt close. And I remember Whip shouting this way for the government, and we were shouting this way for socialism.
The ayes to the right, 316. The noes to the left, 311.
The ayes have it. Unlocked.
So you were 6 votes away from possibly resigning.
Yes, I would have gone over that.
Had you prepared for that?
Not desperately. I rather hoped I'd win it, which we did in the end. But no, I was just, because I think, you see, that's the other thing that that is important about the job, is that what you owe people is your conviction. You owe them the duty to do what you believe to be right. Now, it may not be right sometimes, and you may end up in a situation, and I have obviously, where people profoundly disagree with your decision or don't like what you've done. But you've got to be prepared to walk away, because, that's the deal. The deal is, it's an honour to do the job, but then on the other side is, you do it in the way that you think is right.
In spring 2004, just months after his narrow escape, Blair was in even worse trouble. His popularity was slumping and relations with Brown were worse than ever. This time, Blair began to crack. Brown thought his time had come at last.
2004 was a really rotten period, and I think it was just a coming together of a whole series of things.
The pressure mounted internally on him to sort of produce a timetable, to sort of name the day, to say when he was going to move on and give way. And without any doubt at all, this got him down.
There was a point at which he slightly lost confidence in himself and persuaded himself, for all sorts of reasons, some political, some the fact that it was at the time pretty difficult with Gordon, that kind of 8 years is what you get in modern politics. And I remember he said it to us so many times. There was a point at which we were absolutely convinced he'd made his mind up. I was persuaded sufficiently to go away and start writing a few sort of thoughts as to how you might explain it and frame the argument as to how you were going to announce it and so forth.
I think he was probably going through, well, let's put it this way, a wobbly period inside himself, inside his head.
After private talks between the two men, Brown believed that Blair had promised him he would leave Downing Street. Brown's team encouraged even the director of Number 10's political unit to pack her bags and go.
There was a sort of flurry around of a fair amount of kind of briefing that an agreement had been reached, which, did include various people around Gordon. I think talking to a whole range of people, myself included, about the fact that, that there was an agreement, certainly, therefore why hasn't this happened? To which my response was, I don't know there's been an agreement. And, that's not what I'm told, or B, what I think. And I do think it was another of those examples, I think, of which have happened, several times, where Tony and Gordon were saying something to each other, and the truth is, none of us know.
Gordon Brown is quoted as saying to Blair, "When are you going to F off and give me a date? I want the job now." Blair says he did not do any deal with Brown.
In 2004, did you ever say to Gordon Brown, in 2004, I'm going soon, get ready?
One of the things that I've had to think about a lot in talking about these things is the degree to which I want to go over conversations that have taken place. But in the end, you don't do deals about the job of being Prime Minister or indeed leader of the Labour Party. And the reason I decided that I should continue doing the job was because I felt that was the right thing to do for the Labour Party and for the country. Now, I'm not going to go back over all the conversations that we've had over a long period of time about these things, because they're between me and him, and don't take that as speculation either way. But it's not helpful to do that. Not when he's actually sitting there doing the job now. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to be difficult about it. It's just what I feel.
What's it like to work with somebody who you know wants your job?
You know, when you're Prime Minister, you're aware that other people may want to succeed you. And I always used to say to people, it's not an ignoble ambition. I mean, why shouldn't he want to be Prime Minister? The important thing is to make sure that in the meantime we work together for the good of the country. And as I say, by and large, although I'm not saying there weren't real problems along the way, by and large I think that's what happened. But it never bothered me.
Blair made a big decision. His personal mission to reform health and education had to go on.
He kind of recovered his nerve and decided that actually he had a lot left in him and he was going to carry on. And I think part of that was about the energy that he felt he had and that was going to be required to drive through the public service reform programme.
But the idea, that he might pass on to somebody who didn't believe in that way of looking at the public sector, who may not withstand the pressure, the counter-pressure against those reforms, or somebody worse who just simply didn't believe in them himself, was an important factor for him.
Once it was understood that Blair wouldn't go after all, Brown is quoted as saying to his one-time friend, "There is nothing that you could ever say to me now that I could ever believe." As a third general election drew near, staff at 10 Downing Street were wondering whether Blair's mission could ever be achieved with Brown at the helm of a powerful Treasury.
There was a lot of impatience in Number 10, and there was a sense that there was a recognition in Number 10 that Tony probably did not have more than half a third term to work with, and if he was going to use that half a third term effectively, he should try to be really in control of what the government was doing on the domestic front, and that it was difficult to do that if you were constantly fighting a battle with the Treasury.
In January 2005, Blair's advisors started work on a top-secret plan to break up the Treasury and concentrate power at Number 10.
There was a 2005 plan. I was too junior and too suspect, possibly because I went for walks in the park with Gordon Brown's advisors, to be trusted with the 2005 plan. So I actually didn't really understand about it until after the election, in which I remember meeting John Burt and another advisor in a room with the plan.
From the Prime Minister's point of view, he was finding it harder and harder to drive his own policy agenda through. We looked in detail. He'd been in office 2 terms. How could government function more effectively? And we really went back to first principles in terms of how he would lead his government, what the basic processes of government should be.
At the heart of that plan was the view that the Treasury needed to be broken up as an organisation, that it become too powerful, that this notion that there were 2 seats of power in government that was dysfunctional was going to be addressed by this plan.
was a sense in the civil service itself that the Treasury as an institution had lost some of its old capabilities as a finance department, and its focus had been too much on policy and too little on ensuring value for money for the taxpayer.
A revealing detail of the plan was a reference to a new Chancellor. This figure, the plan said, should have a lack of personal investment in previous policies. So it seemed clear that Blair's top advisors, working for him in secret, believed he might sack Brown as Chancellor.
I think there was a general supposition, but it was no more than a supposition, that it was likely that the Prime Minister would move the Chancellor after the election.
Did you ever consider moving Gordon Brown from the Treasury?
No, that's not really quite correct. I mean, I've read a lot about this stuff, but what you do before you go into an election and you think you've got a good chance of winning is you're preparing for the afterwards. And there are all sorts of different things that could have happened after the 2005 election. And indeed, there are all sorts of things that could happen now. I mean, if Gordon decided to make these types of changes, but this wasn't ad hominem. It was to do with whether, you could, as many other countries do, separate the spending issues, and you have an office of management of the budget and so on, as opposed to a finance ministry. And in the end, it was decided not to do that. But it never got very far.
Brown had proved unassailable. And at the 2005 general election, it was Brown who was now the electable face of New Labour.
In fact, you better make that too.
Yeah. Who's that one for?
Blair was forced to offer himself alongside his rival on a twin ticket.
Where is he?
He even had to buy the ice creams.
Here, Gordon. It's not often a chance to get something. Not often you get something for free.
This is probably the most successful Chancellor in Gordon Brown the country's had for 100 years. And so without breaching any of the protocols about how I decide things, we'd be pretty foolish to put that at risk.
Voters witnessed an extraordinary show of unity.
It's about working as a team. It's about trying to break new ground all the time. People have different attributes that they can bring to teamwork.
Yeah, I think it's about recognising whatever the difficulties and whatever the tensions are, a few from time to time, that actually it's a partnership that's worked, that's done a lot for the country.
And the next challenge is how Britain can be one of the great success stories in the next stage of the global economy.
With Brown's help, Blair won power for a third and final time.
We've got a mandate to govern this country again.
Blair had a last chance to entrench his market reforms before Gordon Brown took over. And this time he didn't have to worry about the opinion polls. He would never again stand for election.
Yes, I think it did loosen inhibitions. It also gave the people working with me a sense of urgency as well, a sense of, you can't sit back, you've got to push forward. There is a sense in which, if you know you're going, you can take a few more risks and you're not so concerned with short-term popularity.
Blair went for broke. A new financial regime for hospitals and a bill to give more independence to state schools caused more bitter opposition. When Blair got into trouble over the crisis in Lebanon, too, an attempt was made to force him out of office. 17 MPs wrote to Blair and begged him to resign.
I tried to get hold of one or two of the participants, but they were unavailable, surprise, surprise. And, we're all over the country and not responding to pages, not responding to telephones. So we knew that there was an operation on, though. We knew that there was a fairly serious operation on.
There was controversy when it emerged that one of the rebel MPs, Tom Watson, had visited Gordon Brown in Scotland 2 days before the letter. The purpose was, he said, to drop off a present for Brown's baby boy. The media speculated about Brown's role as Blair raged against the plotters.
There was a feeling that probably there were people around Gordon who could have known this was going on and could have tried to stop it, but they didn't. To put it politely, he was pretty angry. In fact, very angry.
His first reaction was, I'm not going to be, pushed out of office by a bunch of, relatively unimportant backbench members of Parliament. I'm not going to overreact to this. But then another calculation kicked in, and it always did with him. Yeah, you have to understand this. The very last thing he ever wanted to contemplate was that there would be a scene over his departure, that there would be a sort of divisive, awful family internal party row, in which saucepans would be thrown and doors would be slammed, and the whole unedifying spectacle would put the public off the government and the party for years after.
This time, Blair was finally forced to say he would go.
The next party conference in a couple of weeks will be my last party conference as party leader. Next TUC next week will be my last TUC, probably to the relief of both of us.
But even then, bruised and boxed into a corner, Blair decided not to go right away. He thought even just a few months more could be vital if he was going to leave with his public service reforms well established. In his final weeks in power, he was still trying to get the job finished.
I'm working really hard. I've not worked harder, actually, in the last 9 months, or the whole time as Prime Minister, than in the last 9 months. So I kind of feel as well that I'm sprinting up to the wire, that I'm continuing doing the job.
Our cameras captured an urgent atmosphere in Downing Street as Blair met his policy staff to check and recheck on how his reforms were going.
Is there some problem with this next wave of contracts?
There's the prospect of some delay, which is to do with agreement with the Treasury.
You need to get this underway. You don't want any sense that this thing is slowing up on the health service side.
Blair wanted to project complete certainty that reform would go on once Brown took over.
We just need to keep absolutely pushing it all the way. I mean, I was just saying to Andrew that I've spoken to Gordon about this at length, and I'm sure he is going to continue with this programme and continue with the people doing it and driving it. So, I think those fears in the end that it might pull back, I don't think are going to happen at all.
But right up to the last minute, Blair felt his personal presence was essential.
You carry on doing it if you think you're probably best placed to do it.
And you did.
Yes, I did think that.
I'm in the best position.
Yeah, and that was no disrespect to my successor or to anybody else, but I'd been working this thing the whole time.
We filmed with Tony Blair on the day he handed power to Gordon Brown. As he prepared to leave office, Blair said he finally believed his reform mission was secure.
It's not that I couldn't have gone on for a little longer. I probably could, but the fact is that 10 years is a long time. I feel that I have put in place certain things that are now going to last, and therefore it's the right time to hand over.
Blair had spent 10 years trying to change Britain his way. He had gone to the brink and back. Somehow he still had his Chancellor by his side. But now, finally, his time had run out. Next week in the Blair years, we tell the inside story of how and why Tony Blair and George Bush decided to invade Iraq.
That's next Sunday at 10:15 on BBC One.